In ancient Rome, Emperor Nero hunts Christians. In prison, the Apostle John sees the apocalypse. In Jerusalem, Jews revolt in all-out war. For them, it's the end of the world. One Christian woman holds the key to a war of angels and demons that will change the future forever. Chronicles of the Apocalypse is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, telling the story of the book of Revelation in the 1st century. 4 supernatural novels. Read them all, from Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, to Judgment, Wrath of the Lamb. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Apocalypse by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
All right, we are officially recording. Brian, I'm out in the country. I didn't explain. I explained this to you a little bit in the email. So this is the time of day where I usually have the best luck doing interviews, recording via internet. But if for some reason I disappear, you just go solo until I can get back in this link or figure it out. Okay. Sometimes the internet, the country internet out here is a little spotty. But anyway, we should survive it. But thanks for coming back on, man. I know it's sooner.
Thanks for having me.
It's sooner than what I think a lot of people were expecting, but the subject that me wanting to talk to you last time didn't necessarily like open up a can of worms. I mean, there are some people that commented on Facebook and stuff, but I'm noticing, like I noticed my emails and my Facebook messages went through the roof with people that were interested. This is making sense to them. And they're asking questions. Cool. They're asking questions. They wanted more book recommendations. I could just tell this was a good conversational piece. People were asking for you to come on sooner, but I usually don't ask people to come on and spend hours of their time more than at least once every couple months or so. But anyway, you sent me that email. I was chomping at the bit. I was like, let's do it. And I think we kind of decided on mainly sticking to Matthew chapter 24 because it's so important and sort of a baseline for the preterist way of thinking. But as you know, there are no rules. We can go wherever we want. And you're kind of, I'm the captain kind of, but you're also running the wheel. So this is going to be fun. So thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I love doing this because I do see that there's a need and I do see a hunger. And so it is worth it to me to do these series, because another thing I find is that a lot of Christians are like me. Like, you know, if you're hungry to learn more about something that you don't know that much about, you're not satisfied with one episode. It's like, I want to hear more in depth about all these different various issues, and I want to get more in depth. So that's why I'm really into doing series of these, because it'll help you drill down. But at the end of the day, I do want to say, you know, you're not going to get you're going to get an introduction to knowledge through these videos, but you've got to do the footwork yourself. You've got to get some of the books of these guys that are scholars that will walk you through the full paradigm and explain details from a biblical, godly, scholarly perspective. You know, and of course, my references are I always give the same few references. It's any of Ken Gentry's books on eschatology, any of Gary DeMar's books on end times. Those are my 2 guys that are go-to guys. And I always point everyone to their websites and just buy all the books they have, because that's basically what I did. And it was very, very satisfying and fulfilling for me. And you know, there are more writers than that, but those are 2 guys that are very readable, very solid.
How old were you when you started researching the post-mill perspective?
About 20 years ago, I guess.
Okay, yeah, you've been in a lot longer than I have. You know, and to just back up what Brian's saying, from my own personal experience, this is how I approach something. And I noticed that this is not how not everybody approaches things today. When I would listen to the interviews, when I first started exploring the post-mill perspective, I noticed a trend where somebody that had a post-mill mindset was brought on and kind of paraded as a spectacle on a show. And they would shotgun all 4 million different questions, and you can randomly think in the course of a conversation, get a 3-second answer, and then decide if they thought it was credible or not. That drove me nuts. There were real scholars out there that made some amazing points, and I just wanted to methodically look at what they had to say. So instead of going to the internet for 30 seconds, I went to the books, and I went to their lecture series. You can find their a lot of people don't like to read. You can type in Gary DeMar anything related to eschatology. You're going to find either a 2-hour conversation or a lecture series. R.C.
Or
Sproul's
debate.
R.C. Sproul's The Last Days According to Jesus is 12 easily digestible lectures from Matthew 24 to Revelation on the subject. And then Ken Gentry's got stuff all over the place. If you have specific questions, you can go in depth exploring just what's on YouTube with these guys, or order their books. It's really important to do that and not just to get sucked into the superficial level of conversation. Like,
yes. And I want to telegraph something, and that is there's a book coming out that is going to be a game changer in the book of Revelation, and it's Ken Gentry's commentary on the book of Revelation. It's called The Divorce of Israel. It is a scholarly commentary, so it's kind of heavy, but it's a partial preterist commentary on the book of Revelation. I've been privileged to be able to read through the thing twice. It's not out yet. It's coming out in the next few months, hopefully. It's been coming for a few years now. Anyway, because I know him, I've been able to read it, and I used it as the foundation for my novel series, Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And I have to tell you, it is a game changer because it's good, solid scholarship. It's not crazy anything. It's just he not only provides a good, solid preterist understanding of the book of Revelation from a post-millennial perspective that's very reasonable, but he also addresses all these, questions and doubts and skeptical things about the interpretation in a very good, solid way. I'm telling you, it's 2 volumes. It's gonna be awesome.
Brian's not necessarily, I don't think any of us really like being a self-promoter, but I actually listened to your book on End Times Prophecy on Audible, which I told you last time. And I think that as far as a concise and respectful approach to tackling this topic for newbies, that's the best book I've run into so far. I've read 8 or 9 at this point, so I haven't read the full spectrum of what's out there. But when I listened to your book, it was very thoughtful. It was very targeted. And I was like, this is such a good introduction to this subject. It was 6 or 7 hours. It's easy to listen to. Guys, go find Brian's books on Audible. Find them on his website. Is it briangodawa.com?
Yeah, and sign up there because also I will let you know when the Gentry book is out, and I will probably be raffling off a couple of his books for free for those who are on my email list. So definitely sign up at godawa.com, and I'll keep you updated on other things related to eschatology in that sense.
And I'm not just saying this because I want to flatter Brian. I have already recommended Brian's book first to people that wanted a basic overview of this topic starting out. It's perfect for that. It's a perfect icebreaker because he covers all kinds of different topics that are kind of the big questions everybody has, up front. So anyway, what are we talking about tonight, Brian?
Matthew 24, baby.
Now, Matthew 24, in my opinion, I'd be interested in your opinion, was for me the game changer. That's why I think Matthew 24 is so important. When I read about this generation, it radically changed the way that we talked about this a little bit last time. It radically changed how I started approaching Matthew 24, which sort of was like that thread that started to unravel my entire quilt. Matthew 24 was a game changer for me. That's why I wanted to start here because
Absolutely.
you and I have had so many connections, even though we've never really hung out. We're connected to the fringe Christian world, the Nephilim culture, the conspiracy end time stuff. And how often does Matthew 24 get brought up as a right now quotation? All the time. And you can't do it. I don't think there's anything in Matthew 24. Maybe save maybe a reference to the future coming of Christ that people can use to this day. So let's get into it, man.
Yeah, for me personally too, it was because Revelation has always been, very difficult, and I kind of avoided it for many years because it's just so complex, and I know there's so many different interpretations that to me intrinsically it just seems like, well, whatever interpretation I have, if you're aware of the other interpretations, you've got to be humble enough to say, well, this is what I believe it is, but you can't stand and say, this is the absolute interpretation because it's so ambiguous, right? And now I do believe strongly in my interpretation, and I think you can, if you study, you can come to a conclusion, but it requires a lot. And so for me too, it was reading these men's descriptions of how Matthew 24 is not to be fulfilled in a future second coming of Christ, but actually was fulfilled in a coming in judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70 by Christ in the clouds. It's a judgment coming, not a end of the world coming type of thing. And that was the for me as well, the doorway, because, and it makes, it's a lot easier to make the proofs. But it's interesting because the first half is the easy part to prove to people. And then the second half, and I say let's get to that near the end. But there's those few verses that seem the most difficult to overcome. And once I studied them biblically in the Old Testament, I just embraced it. But here's the thing. Let's come at this contextually, There's so many that will approach Matthew 24 and it's all this. Well, obviously, they assume their own assumptions. Obviously, this is about the end of the world. And so then how can we see? And it obviously has never happened yet. And to which I say, well, poppycock, because if you really look at the context, that passage, that whole chapter, and then some, is actually contextually very clearly saying this. Because the Jewish people of the first century rejected Jesus as Messiah, that generation in the first century was going to be judged specifically by God by destroying their house or the temple that represented the old covenant. And that destruction was going to represent the ultimate destruction of the old covenant and the bringing in of the new covenant with Messiah. Now, Messiah had come, died and risen from the dead, and he had inaugurated the new covenant. But God is not a God of philosophy, he's a God of history. And so even though there's a spiritual truth of the new covenant actually being inaugurated in the first century around 30 AD, it is not historically consummated until 40 years later at the destruction of the old covenant earthly symbols. So that is how God operates. And, it's a messy historical reality, but that's the context of how I'm going to, you and I or whatever are going to look at this passage. Now, I get that from very clear passages. The thing that people don't do is they don't often read Matthew 23, which is actually the context of Matthew 24. We all know now that the chapter distinctions are not in the original language, so it's all contextually together. And when you go through all the woes that Jesus is talking to, woe to you Pharisees and hypocrites, he's basically telling them, you are rejecting Messiah, so God's going to reject you and your people. And ultimately he gets down to, he's saying, you hypocrites, you whitewashed tombs, right? We all know that. But then he starts to come in on the key verses when he says in verse 31, or verse 29, woe to you, Pharisees and hypocrites, you build the tombs of the prophets and say, if we had lived in the days of the fathers, we would not have taken part in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Then Jesus says, thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you going to escape the sentence to Gehenna? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, etc., that you kill and crucify, so that on you, verse 35, may come all the righteous blood shed on the land. Now, people read that as the earth, but the word in Greek is actually the land, because the prophets on the land are talking about the prophets of Israel. From the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. And then Jesus wraps it up by saying, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So he's talking to these Pharisees, these leaders of Israel. They're rejecting him as Messiah. And he's saying, all the blood of the prophets is on you. Now, obviously, why? Why? Because they're going to kill the Messiah. The Messiah is the ultimate prophet of all the prophets. So when he's talking to them, he's saying, you, this generation. So this generation is rejecting Messiah, Now, obviously, there's a remnant that will believe, but in general, the leaders of Israel are rejecting him in this generation. All right, and that's where you start to realize, oh, he's talking to these people, and he's saying that you are rejecting Messiah, and the blood of all the prophets is on you because you're going to murder Messiah. And then he says this, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that kills the prophets and stones those sent to it. How often would I have gathered you as hen gathers her brood under the wings? But see, your house is left to you desolate. The word house is what the word is that is used of the temple. So he's saying, your temple is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you'll not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So he's literally saying you're rejecting the blood of the prophets is on you because you're killing the Messiah. It's this generation that has that blood guilt. And therefore, I'm going to destroy your temple because of it. And then the beginning of chapter 24 says, Jesus left the temple and was going away to the disciples. And then that's when we get into the Olivet Discourse. But I want to lay the point that the very context of this is that it's the rejection of Messiah, the destruction of the Old Covenant temple, and it's because they've rejected him. Now, you jump to the end of chapter 24, and he says that same verse again where he says, chapter 24, verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So it's like a bookend. He says, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. Then he tells you all these things, and then at the end he repeats himself and he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So hermeneutically, we come to this text, we have to say, well, how does Jesus tell us to interpret it? Do we come at this and say, what do I think these terms mean? Or do we say, what does Jesus say? And if Jesus says everything within this passage will happen, before this generation dies, then however you interpret it, it has to be interpreted as being taken place within that generation. And of course, our claim as preterists is that within 40 years, a generation, that actually all did take place when the temple was destroyed in AD 70. So that's the big context that says you've got to interpret it within that paradigm. Does that make sense?
100%. And that's, that is usually the game changer, is when instead of regurgitating the subtle twistings over the years that we've all heard in church, I gave my story last time, I would quote Matthew 24. I would say, the generation that sees these things will not fully pass away. That's not what the Bible says. That's not what Jesus said. And in my studies in the history of liberalism versus the church, I noticed that this was a central issue. They always attacked Jesus's own words to prove he wasn't divine because he got it wrong. And most of the church, because they had adopted the mindset that what Jesus said as far as timing was figurative, but the events would be literal, they lost the argument every time. They in the name of literalism, they had to take half of it figurative. And that's the question, right? There is something, you cannot be a hyper literalist in Matthew 24. If you are literal on some things, it forces you to take others figuratively. There's no way that it could all be figurative or all be literal. The fact that Jesus said this generation will not pass away until these things happen, and we look at the list of those things and we say, well, those haven't happened yet. Well, then Jesus must have been figurative in his timing. If Jesus wasn't figurative in his timing, then the events that we're looking at, if we look at Scripture, show us just exactly what kind of figurative language it's using. It can really help you realize, what do I need? Using Scripture to interpret Scripture helps us in Matthew 24 figure out what to take figuratively and what to take literally. Absolutely.
And Gary DeMar has done a lot of writing on this generation. And I think I highly recommend, it's on his website, so you can find it for free. But I highly recommend his writing because that is a major key, that is a sticking point that just converts a lot of us, basically. Because you're right, when you look at that passage, that phrase, actually, this generation, when you look at where it's used throughout the entire New Testament, And we don't even have to go that far. We just say, just look at it, how it's used in Matthew, right? Matthew's writing a book. He's got themes and connections and literary constants. And he uses this phrase, this generation, a lot. And how does he use it? Well, he uses it always in parables or references to judgment of the Jews for rejecting Messiah that will occur with the destruction of the temple. For example, just picking a couple out. Matthew 12, he talks about an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given it to except Jonah, right? And he says, the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. Why? For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, but behold, someone greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will do the same, rise up in judgment with this generation. And so he's making the point that this generation that's rejecting Jesus as Messiah will be judged for its rejection of Messiah. And that's the context of this generation all throughout Matthew. And this generation throughout the New Testament is always a reference to the people who are listening to him in their lifetime. Yeah. So it's just, you just can't escape it, you know. And of course, what futurists will say, well, yeah, that's true. It is elsewhere, except in this case, you know. Again, I think what you said is, you know, and I think we all need to be humble in our hermeneutic, you know, have a humble hermeneutic and recognize that symbolism and figurative language is a part of everyone's discourse, you know, and so as well as what we call literal. And so if you're going to be honest, you're going to have to admit that every time we're reading prophecy, we're going to have to sift out between the literal, the figurative, and the symbolic, and how that all plays into each other. Because you can't just say, oh, it's all, I take it literally, and you don't. Because as you already pointed out, and as we're going to see here even more clearly, that's just not how language works. And so the truth is that prophetic language always includes a mixture of symbolism, literal notions, as well as historical or non-historical references, etc. So there's all kinds of links. So the main thing that brought me to respecting preterism and then ultimately becoming one is that when you go back into the Old Testament, or let me put it this way, most all prophetic references in the New Testament have a precedent in the Old Testament. So if you want to know what these phrases or things, symbols may mean, go back into the Old Testament and you'll find examples of it. And you can learn from how they used it that will help you understand how the New Testament writers are using it. So that's the, you know, interpret scripture with scripture type of principle. And I think that if you do that, you're going to discover, you know, you're going to discover the preterist view is actually the superior view. Let's jump into the first thing that he says. So he says, you know, I say to you, there will not be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down of this temple. And of course, that did happen in AD 70, 40 years within a generation, right? But then it says he's sitting on the Mount of Olives and the disciples ask him, tell when these things will be. Tell us when these things will be. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And then Jesus goes on to, you know, with his Olivet Discourse. And this is an important introductory passage because this is where many people begin to add their assumptions, modern day assumptions of what does the end of the age mean? What does your coming mean, right? And so if we look at these, we're going to find that the end of the age is not what most Christians think it means today. Most Christians today think it clearly is a reference to the end of history, the end of the world, the end of the earth, right? But if you look up that phrase, you know, end of the age, it's not actually what it means. What it actually means is the Jews had a two-age concept. They believed that they were in this age, and then when Messiah came, that it was the age to come. So, and sometimes they use the plurality of there were previous ages, but then when Messiah came, he would be the end of all those ages. And the word age in Greek is aeon, and it basically means an era, like the end of an era. Yeah. And so the preterist understanding is the end of the age is basically the end of the old covenant age. When Messiah comes, he will bring an end to the old covenant age. And it's interesting because this brings in with itself, the notions of the last days. That's another phrase that shows up, the last days and the end times and all that. And if you look at passages where there's a reference to the last days or the end of the ages, and we'll read a couple right now, but you'll see that the apostles themselves were saying the end of the ages, the last days, was right then and there in their time period, in the first century. And let's just read a couple of them. So Hebrews 1:1 says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son. So in that first century, he's saying these are the last days. Is that the last days of the earth? Well, no, it's the last days of the old covenant. Hebrews 9:26 uses similar. It's like a language system. There's lots of different ways to refer to it, but it all means the same thing. Hebrews 9:26 says, but now once at the consummation of the ages, Jesus has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now, look, what's the consummation of the ages? Is it the end of the earth and all of history? No, he's saying that Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, which happened around 30 AD, right, happened at the consummation of the ages. Why? Because when Messiah came, he would bring the new age, the new covenant age that would replace the old covenant age. And by the way, there's tons of these verses. I could keep going on. 1 Corinthians 10:11, Paul says, now these things that happened to them in the old covenant, as an example, they were written for our instruction in the new covenant, upon whom the end of the ages have come. Folks who are listening to this, you've got to realize that their concept of end of the ages, of the last days, is not the last days of the earth or history. It's the end of the old covenant age. And that's the context. And by the way, in my books, I give all if you in my end times book, I give you an opportunity to get a free book called Matthew 24 Fulfilled. And I go through every verse in Matthew 24 and I show multiple biblical and historical passages that prove how each verse was fulfilled. And sometimes that's what it takes for people. They just need to see those details. That's how it was for me. I had to see look at how many of these passages clearly say, oh, wow, the last days and the end of the ages was in the first century. Well, then that can't be in our future. So therefore, what does the last days mean? Maybe it doesn't mean what we impose upon it. Maybe it means what they intended it to mean.
Well, and like you said, the question was not, what are the signs of the end of all things? They could have very well asked that question. They used the word specific to the thought. Words mean things. You as a writer know that words mean things. They reflect the intention of the question. If you put yourself in the mindset of these disciples, they don't understand what's happening. They don't see the big picture. It's easy 2,000 years removed from these conversations to say, Jesus is the Christ. The church age is here. The age of the Gentile. Blah. We know 2,000 years of history now that they did, right? It's hindsight's always 2020. So we're sitting there and you put yourself in their position and they don't fully understand what's happening, right? They know though that Christ is here. What does that look like? We were expecting a military leader as well. That's not what they're seeing. They're asking Jesus, knowing that the old ways are coming to an end. They want to know what's coming next. It's like sitting back. I remember the first time I sold my house, my first house that I bought. I sold it. We're sitting there. We moved things. We sat down. My wife and I had been married for 4 or 5 years. And I remember we just looked at each other and said, well, it's the end of an era in our marriage, Yeah. And that's the same. It was like, to the future, toast. No, it wasn't like the end of the world. It was the end of an era. It was the end of an age in our marriage. That is the language that's being used in this passage. There is nothing in the language that supports an end of the world conversation or scenario. They want to know what is coming next and what's going to herald what comes next. What is specifically, they asked him specifically, what are the things to look for that will clue us in to this as we know it ending?
Absolutely. Now, look, there's a lot more that we can go into, but let's keep moving in the interest of, I want to hit some specifics, but we've got a lot to cover too. And I love this very concept of the last days because I think it's crucial. I mean, the book of Hebrews has these passages where it explains how like they were in the, in from 30 AD to 70 AD, 40 years, that was a transition period between covenants, right? The new covenant had been inaugurated with Christ, but it was fading in, and the old covenant was fading out, but it wasn't gone until the temple was fully destroyed. This is the paradigm that I'm talking about. And so this is where it explains a lot of things in Hebrews, where he talks about how, the old is obsolete and getting ready to disappear. What does that talk about? Well, they were in the transition period where the old covenant was disappearing, the new covenant was coming in, and it was finalized at the destruction of the temple. Why? This is very crucial, because the temple was the incarnation of the old covenant. All the atonement, all the rituals, all the priestly sacrifices, the very religion of the old covenant was rooted in that temple. And so God destroying that temple historically was the ultimate eradication, or the obsolescence of that earthly old covenant that was now finally replaced by the new covenant. So that's what's going on here. So if we move along, and I'm gonna jump over a couple of things, because some of these things are sort of generic, like Jesus says, oh, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And this is the part of the passage that to me was always sort of weak in general, and I always felt like, well, Jesus says, oh, some people are going to come and say I'm the Messiah, but look, and then he says you will hear wars and rumors of wars, and I'm like, all throughout history, there's been wars and rumors of wars. There's no specific, and all throughout history, we've had people saying, I am the Christ and I'm the Messiah. So how are those prophecies helpful at all? And, I've honestly just had trouble with them. But it's interesting that I came to discover that they actually make the most amount of sense in the first century. And what I mean by that is that, when he says, you will hear wars and rumors of wars. Well, guess what? There's one time period in history where hearing about wars and rumors of wars would be a unique thing. And that's called Pax Romana. Because the Roman Empire had conquered the known world, they had, in the first century, they had what was called Pax Romana, meaning all the world was at peace because they were all in subjection to Rome, right? And so that way, if we start hearing about wars and rumors of wars now, there's always been. But in that first century, it would be unique because they were under Pax Romana. And as a matter of fact, Tacitus writes about how in this time period, around the time period of Nero, all of a sudden the rise of wars and rumors of wars start happening, and there's turmoil that ends up rising up within the Roman Empire right around this time period of like 60 AD or so. And so it's very interesting that makes that passage relevant like it doesn't to any other period in history, right? And there's another thing where it's like, these, famines and earthquakes in various places, they're, again, how is that unique? But there were actually, there are actual scriptural examples of famines and earthquakes happening in various places. So it certainly applies to the first century. And he says, but these are the birth pains, right? And then he says, what does it say? False prophets will arise. Where am I looking for? The one where it says that they will tell you to go out into the wilderness, the false prophets. I think it's, further on down, verse 24, it's kind of connected. False Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, right? Again, isn't that happened throughout all of history? But he says, if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Well, again, I suppose there are some prophets that are out in the wilderness nowadays. But at that time period of the first century, right within that time period around 60 AD, Josephus, the famous Jewish historian who is not a Christian, but he writes about what was happening in those days. And he writes about multiple different leaders that were claiming to be the Messiah. And they were out in the wilderness. Why? Because they were gathering armies to fight Rome. Why? Because around 66 AD, there was a civil war within Israel, and they were rising up and standing against Rome. And Rome ended up bringing its armies to quell the revolt. So it's called the Jewish Revolt, and Josephus wrote about it. But what's interesting is that was when these various, Josephus writes about a guy called the Egyptian who led people out into the wilderness, and they were gathering armies to rise up and saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm going to rescue us against Rome. See, it was all part of this misunderstood paradigm that they thought Messiah was going to come and free them from the Romans with military power. So that makes more sense then than it does now, right? Because they're in literally the wilderness of Israel and they're claiming to be the Messiah to rescue them. So it fits perfectly within that time period. Like I said, these are still more generic prophecies that people can, meander or finagle and make them fit in different time periods. But I think they fit best within that first century.
Well, in 2 Peter 2, Peter, obviously there weren't chapters and numbers on the scrolls and parchments that were written on, but there's a whole chapter in our Bible dedicated to false teachers, right? That Peter writes in 2 Peter, because false prophets were not in short supply. They were popping up everywhere. The apostles had to specifically address that. It was a huge thing. At the same time, I know when we end up getting to the end of this verse about the whole world, something to back up the issue with the famine is Acts 11:28. If you go to Acts 11:28, this is something that is spoken of. This is just a pure scripture. This isn't an interpretation. This is just what it says. And one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. And this took place in the days of Claudius. So here you have, with this worldly language again, famine over the entire world.
Amen. Amen. And then at the end of that, and this is funny because I just had this debate on Facebook with Rob Skiba, because he goes, will some preterists please tell me how the gospel was preached through the whole world as a testimony to all nations before the end in the first century? Because Jesus says in verse 14, and the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed through the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And that is in verse 14. So I wrote back to him and I explained something that in some ways this is one of the easiest things to prove, but because modern Christians have these modern scientific assumptions about what words mean instead of reading them within the context of the ancient mind, they automatically assume their own ideas. And so it says, I'm sorry, I lost my passage. Okay, so he goes, the gospel preached to all the world as a witness to all the nations. And they say, well, that obviously hasn't happened yet, right? And whenever someone says that obviously hasn't happened, they're usually showing you that they automatically assume a hyper-literal interpretation of what's being said.
Yeah.
And that's actually called in logic begging the question. You're assuming the very thing that is in question. It's like, well, we don't know that it is hyper-literal anyway. So it's like, how are you to say that obviously hasn't happened? And so you when you look at the language, you find that actually in the Bible, it says that passage was fulfilled. And I gave some examples. I'll give them here now. But just as an example, the whole gospel preached to the whole world. We think that means the globe, right? And, the whole world is the globe, right? Well, actually, the Greek word for world is oikumene, which basically, if you look up that word in the New Testament, you will find that it basically means the known Roman Empire. We could go into it, but I want to keep moving. But the idea is the whole world doesn't mean the globe. It means the known world to them at that time, which was the Roman Empire. So, for instance, in Luke 2 says, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the world. Yeah. Did the Romans take a census in North America? Obviously not. They're talking about the Roman Empire. So these phrases, you can't impose your own understanding. Look at it through their eyes. Okay, so that's first of all. But then, no matter how you interpret the phraseology, right? Like we assume, in order for the gospel to preach to the whole world, well, that obviously hasn't happened yet because there are native tribes in the Congo or whatever who haven't heard the gospel. That's this literalistic, scientific precision that we demand of the text, that they didn't think that way. They didn't think, well, every single person who's ever existed on the face of the earth has to have heard the gospel. No, that's not what they're talking about. They're speaking in generic terms that it's getting out to the known world that was to them. But no matter how you interpret that, I can still show you that the Bible itself says the gospel was preached to all the world in the first century.
That's one of the funny things I heard Gary DeMar say one day when I was investigating this. I didn't have an opinion. I was in a debate or something, and he pretty much just asked, what could I say to convince you that the gospel's been preached to the whole world? Essentially, he already knows. The Bible says that the gospel was preached to the whole world. So that's where you're headed. And I was like, what? Where?
Yes.
And then you start going through like Colossians 1:5 and 1:23 and Romans 1:8. Anyway, go ahead.
Let's look at a couple of those. Let's look at the best ones. By the way, I want to add something too. It says, to the whole world for a witness to all the nations. Again, that's another thing. We think of geopolitical nations. China. Has it been preached to China? Has it been preached to, these nations in the Congo, whatever, right? But that's not what nations was a very generic term that could refer to a lot of different things, but it basically is a reference to Gentile peoples, but this phrase of to all the nations is another generic hyperbole.
Yeah.
They think that it has to be literal, scientifically exact, all and every single one without one exception. And that's not what the language means. But again, let's see where it actually says. The Bible actually says that. And so, like you mentioned, Colossians 1, it says the gospel, 1 verse 5, the gospel, verse 6, which has come to you. Paul is writing this in the first century, in this time period, right? Oh, hold on.
Okay.
My wife texting me, sorry. During that time period, it says the gospel has come to you as indeed in the whole world, and is bearing fruit and increasing. So he's saying the gospel has come into the whole world in his time period. But he says it even stronger because in Romans 16, he says he's talking about the gospel, the preaching of Jesus Christ, verse 25. And then verse 26 says, this gospel has now been disclosed through the prophetic writings, has been made known to all nations. That's literally the phrase that Jesus was saying, witness to all the nations. And Paul is saying in Romans, in the first century, the gospel has been made known to all the nations. Now, like you said, there's a lot of these verses, but certainly if you're a biblical Christian, this should be enough to tell you, well, look, if the Bible says it's been fulfilled in one verse, let alone two, and by the way, there's more like 4 verses, it says the gospel has been preached to the whole creation.
That's what I say. First, it's Colossians 23. That one is Romans 16:25 blew my mind, number 1. But verse 23 in Colossians also did.
Read it.
If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven. That's once again, it's an apostolic testimony that this isn't going to happen in the future. It's happened already.
Right. And so my argument to the hyperliteralists is, okay, look, to me, that should clearly show us that the language, all creation under heaven, is not hyperliteral or scientifically precise. It's just a hyperbole. The thing made known to, the phrase made known to all the nations is not scientifically precision of all nations. The whole world is not scientific. It's a generic reference to something spreading out all over the place, Now, that's my argument that clearly that's what it is because it's saying it happened in the first century and there's no one who would claim that the gospel had gone to North America or whatever, right? However, even if you don't understand it that way, even if you just look at the text, if the text itself says it's literally been fulfilled using the same language, there's no more argument to be made.
You can't argue. How do you argue that? That's the final word. It's the final authority.
Exactly. And in Mark 16, Jesus says, remember, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. That phrase that Jesus is saying was fulfilled in the verse you just said. So the point here is that there's multiple ways of saying it, and all of those ways in Scripture has been fulfilled. The gospel preached to all the nations. Gospel preached to the whole world. Oikumene. There's another verse where it says the gospel is preached to the whole world. Cosmos. The word
Romans
cosmos.
1:8.
Romans 1:8. Please read it.
First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you because your faith is proclaimed in all the cosmos.
Yeah, the cosmos, right? To all the nations, in all creation. Like, that should show you that there's hyperbolic language in prophecy, and it's beautiful to me. It's a way of saying, like, this is out there. God has got it out to everyone. Not everyone's going to accept it, but, God has got the message out, and then the end will come.
If that was the only verse, if Romans 1:8 was the only verse that we had to back up and prove that
it would be enough.
Oikomenos was enough. It would be enough. But we have verses that specifically, not only is that a beautiful passage, but specifically use that same terminology, that same word, that say the same thing. Like, I don't understand how somebody can do a comparative study here and walk away and still hold to this sort of modern position.
Absolutely.
The Bible doesn't hold to that position.
Absolutely. Now, it's interesting because Rob Skiba actually admitted to me when he finally responded to that passage, and he actually said, okay, I admit that there's hyperbole going on in those passages, and that it was fulfilled in that sense, right? And so this is why it takes patience, because this is what it took for me. It wasn't I can understand where if you're coming from this weird I'm sorry, not weird, but if you're coming from this futuristic perception, and people are telling you that these verses have been fulfilled, it's going to be shocking, but it's not going to be enough to hear just one verse. You're going to have to go through all of them and see how they're fulfilled. And it's the accumulation of all those that sort of tell you in your mind, oh, it's a different paradigm. It's a completely different paradigm. So I don't blame you if you're not converting to this viewpoint, and I don't expect you to, just because you see us say, oh, there's a couple of these things that have been fulfilled. But this is why we're trying to walk through a lot of it to show you there's a lot. All of this stuff can be shown to be fulfilled, but you got to do the study.
And if you're new to the topic, there's nobody more sympathetic than I am to this. I don't make fun of stupid dispensationalists, just like Brian doesn't. I was one. And I'm not stupid. I don't think you guys we've all grown up in the same world. I get it, but here's the thing. So when you start to critique preterism by using all the arguments you've learned your entire life, number one, be very careful as you listen to Brian and I, that you are not critiquing a caricature of preterism. Dig into the substance of what we're talking about, which is coming from Scripture. This is not like we're all reading the same Bible and just choosing different interpretations. The reasons why we're going through Matthew 24 is because we want to show you where the Bible is telling us how to read Matthew 24 and where the apostles how they read Matthew 24. We want to show you what the Bible is saying, what Jesus' own words are saying about this. And so be careful that you don't attack a caricature. Also, be very careful that when you begin to try to dissect preterism, right, that you look at all of the context of the verses and be very honest with yourself when you are choosing a literal interpretation where you have to take the rest figurative. Don't stand on a hill claiming that you're going to see. This is the biggest problem in the comments. I've watched Jeff Durbin stuff, and I've seen the way people attack in the comments and taking lots of screenshots. And the number one accusation I see from premillennial dispensationalists is that preterism twists the Scripture into an unrecognizable mess, which is such a foreign idea to me now, because when I look at it, I'm like, well, I'm reading it the way it's telling me to read it. I'm looking at Jesus' own words. When I look at the point of view I used to have, I had to twist everything to believe that. What you're accusing me of, you're actually guilty of. I'm making sense of what everyone else over the last 100 years has completely mangled. And
if I can extrapolate a little bit on that, and this has to do with, because you and I have gone through that journey, we have to remain humble and acknowledge that we should remain open. But the idea is, your reaction of it just makes a mess of it is because when you see one or two examples, and you're interpreting it and comparing it to your assumptions of everything else that you assume to be whatever, literally interpreted or what have you. So you're saying it's a mess because you're interpreting it through your paradigm instead of trying to understand it through a different paradigm. The only way we can have a true conversation is if both sides are genuine. Now look, we both have strong viewpoints. Both sides have a strong viewpoint, but the goal is it's not about crushing the other person. It's about seeking to understand through the eyes of the other viewpoint. And that's why you're right, because whenever I see comments, it's amazing how many of them are just these dismissive displays of ignorance that they don't even know what they're saying, which is why about preterism. And that's why you're saying what you're saying, because what I've seen is I don't think I've really seen much of anybody who has really accurately depicted preterism who was debunking it. Now, there may be someone out there who's fair and honest about it, but most of the descriptions that I've seen, they don't understand it correctly. And I think that's because they're still interpreting it through their own paradigm. But nevertheless, this is really important. We're talking a lot about the hermeneutics as we're talking, but it's really key because we've got to realize that we're looking through a worldview that's allowing us to see things, and we have to be willing and attempt to at least try to say, okay, well, if I take their viewpoint, how can I understand it? And I've done that with futurism. I've been a dispensationalist. I've been a premillennialist. I've been a amillennialist, and now I'm a postmillennialist. But even then, I still tell myself, and I'm a preterist postmillennialist, but I still say, you know what? I want to be open because I may be wrong in the long run. And when I try to listen to another viewpoint, I try to understand it through their eyes. So, maybe we're beating a dead horse in the ground, but I think it's crucial for this. Let's jump on to Abomination of Desolation. So, we get to the next passage, right? Unless there's something else you want to. Oh, just to say, we finish this gospel of the testimony to all the nations, and then Jesus says, and then the end will come. All right, so there you have another reference to the end. What is that end? Do we read the word the end and we automatically assume our modern view, well, that's got to be the end of the world, the end of the history? No, wait. The end of what? It doesn't say the end of any. What is it the end of?
And keep in mind, with this issue of the nations, when we were told in these books that the gospel had been preached to all the nations, these books were written a couple years, 2, 3, 4 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. So when Brian brings up this passage, gospel preached to all the nations, then the end will come. Well, when you start looking at it through the preterist sort of ideology, the
paradigm,
yeah, that's exactly what we see when reading it. The gospel was testified to have been preached to all the nations, and then the end came. So
and the end of what?
The end of the Jews.
The Jew. Think about this, folks. To the Jew, put yourself in the world. You've read enough of the Bible. You know that to the Jew, their covenant with Yahweh and their temple was everything, right? Mm-hmm. Yahweh was everything. The covenant, the Mosaic covenant was everything. And so to them, it was the cosmos. Their covenant with Yahweh was the cosmos. It was it. So for their covenant to be destroyed, for their temple to be destroyed, that's the end of the world to them. That's the end of their world, right? So that's the language, again, clearly fits the pattern of the end of the ages, the end of the world, whatever it is. It's about covenant, and that's the central theme throughout the Old and New Testament. So then we go, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, or standing where it should not, let the reader understand, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and those on the housetop go down, and et cetera, et cetera. And, this is another one of those, it's one of those passages where they say, well, that obviously hasn't happened yet. It's like, well,
so many arguments over the years about what the abomination of desolation could be.
Yes. And by the way, I have a view of what it is, but even within the preterist camp, there are multiple views. Yes. And I'm not even certain, I'm not 100% certain of what it is. I think it is based on scriptural, but there are some good, strong explanations by other preterists. But let's just take out a basic biblical approach and say, look, whatever it is you think it is, and obviously he's saying spoken of by Daniel. Okay, so this is something that we know about. You can go back and read about the abomination of desolation. We don't have time right now. I think we can find out right away what this exactly means, and we don't have to we can go through intense exegesis study of the abomination of desolation in Daniel, but that's for another day. But there's a passage where Jesus, in Luke 21, Jesus is giving the same sermon. And he's giving it to, Luke is writing the gospel. And he's writing it to Gentiles. So Matthew is written to Jews mostly. And there's a lot of messianic language, a lot of old covenant language. Luke tends to be less Jewish in the phrases he's using and a little bit more Greek. Why? Because a lot of the Greeks he's writing to wouldn't understand them. So there are times when Luke will explain things to his audience that aren't explained elsewhere. This is one of those times. If you go to Luke 21, Jesus is foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the same sermon, and whether or not you believe it's given at a different time or it's a translation, it doesn't matter. Luke is translating it to the readers to define what it means, and he says this. Jesus is speaking the same thing. He says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation has come near. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart." Basically, it's the same thing, but there's something different there. He doesn't use abomination of desolation. He uses desolation, right? But he defines it what it means, because they wouldn't know what it meant, the Greeks. So now we see within the text, the New Testament text itself, it tells us what the abomination is. And it is Jerusalem surrounded by armies.
Yeah.
In such a way that it will be desolated.
Which,
Guess what
by the
happened
way,
in AD 70?
which, by the way, to plug your books, I still was looking at the idea of the sacrificial system still operating in the temple after the atonement of Christ as possibly being the abomination. But I loved the way you worked this into your novels because when I saw how you wrote the story and I went back and looked at Luke 21, I was like, that man might be onto something.
Yeah. And, and there are, like I said, look, I'll admit there are predators who suggest that actually abomination might be the Jewish zealots who are in the temple and all. And there are some good arguments for those. But just from a basic scriptural approach, this is enough to at least link that and to explain it to a certain degree. And by the way, historically speaking, Eusebius, the church father, tells us that the Christians in Jerusalem at that time, at around, so that would be about 68 AD, when it was surrounded, 66 or 7, when it was surrounded the first time by the armies led by the Roman general Cestius. So the Roman armies came in at first, right? And they surrounded Jerusalem. But then what happened was, some strange things occurred, and they don't know exactly what happened, but all of a sudden they withdrew. The Roman armies withdrew. So this is around, I think, 67 AD.
Did Josephus record Cestius was killed? Was he killed, or was that speculation?
I can't remember, but Cestius left, and then they chased after him. The Jews got courage because they're like, wow, they thought God did it, because he was ready to basically besiege the temple, and he would have gotten in pretty quickly and easily. In your
novel, though, didn't you have him die? I can't remember. Didn't you have them kill him?
I did. They chased him down. They hunted him down, and I think Josephus does say that they found him and they killed him, or he died later. It was something like that. But what's interesting is that was the first time that the Rome surrounded the city of Jerusalem. But think about this. Then they came back 3 years later and then destroyed Jerusalem. But this phrase wouldn't make sense. Think about it. If Jesus is saying, okay, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, how can you flee to the mountains if you're already surrounded by armies, right?
Yeah. This gave him a chance.
Yeah. So, but when they withdrew the first time, then the Christians fled to Pella. Eusebius, the historian, tells us this. And then when the Roman armies came back for the next 3-year siege, then they destroyed the city, but the Christians had already gotten out. So that's an interesting fact of history that fits with this. And Gary DeMar says this all the time. It's like, look, how this verse doesn't make sense for the modern world. If you're in Judea, flee to the mountains. Fleeing to the mountains in the modern day world of warfare means nothing. They can blow up, all the mountains and everything around you. Fleeing to the mountains is not going to protect you in the modern day world. So it doesn't make sense for this
Right.
modern day. But lo and behold, in the first century, it actually did make sense because they literally fled to the mountains and they were protected in that time period. So that's an interesting little comparison. But while we're here on Luke 21, this happens to be one of my, I love this passage because I hope I'm not going too far, but Jesus continues on with some more words that aren't in Matthew 24. He talks about these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that has been written. Alas, women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Oh, that's in Matthew 24 too, right? He says, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people.
Yeah.
Who's
this
he
people.
talking about? The Jews. This people, the Jews, they will fall by the edge of the sword, be led captive among the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And people say, well, that obviously hasn't happened yet. Well, actually, it obviously already has happened. Jerusalem was trampled underfoot by the Roman armies, which were Gentiles, right? And but what's very interesting to me is this phrase, days of vengeance, because a lot of so Jesus is saying these days. What days? The days of the abomination of desolation, the days when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Roman armies, right? The days of the first century when the temple was destroyed. Now that reference, days of vengeance, actually comes from Isaiah, and futurists will often refer to that and say, well, look, that proves that it hasn't happened yet. They'll say, the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because this is Isaiah 61, verse 1. He goes, let's go to this. Luke 18. No, that's not the right one. What am I looking for? I'm looking for where Jesus says this was fulfilled. The year of the Lord's favor. Oh, there it is. Luke 4, 18 through 19. Okay.
That's
So
way
if we
off.
go to Luke 4, 18 through 19, Jesus stands up and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, etc., to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he rolled up the scroll and gave it, said, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Now that's a passage from Isaiah. It's a passage about the coming of Messiah. And futurists will say, but if you go back into the Isaiah passage, you see Jesus closed the book before the end of the verse. He did not read the verse right after that, year of the Lord's favor. What's the verse right after that in Isaiah 61, verse 2? To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. And so futurists think, see, that proves that only the first half was fulfilled, but not the second half, because Jesus said it wasn't fulfilled. But here's the thing, that actually proves the preterist viewpoint, because Jesus is saying the first half was fulfilled in his coming and in his ministry. But then back later in Luke, still the same gospel, right? Luke 4 says the first half of Isaiah 61 was fulfilled, but then later in Luke 21, he says, for these are the days of the vengeance to fulfill all that is written. So you see, Jesus is saying that the days of vengeance of Isaiah are fulfilled in the first century at the destruction of the temple. But it wasn't to happen until another 40 years later.
Yeah.
So this 40-year period is a complex series of events that begins with the death and resurrection and ascension of Messiah to be the king over all the earth. And it ends with the destruction of the earthly emblem of the old covenant. And this is where it's just a beautiful fulfillment in my mind, if that makes any sense to people.
Yeah, 2 points real quick. Number one, No, and I don't know how much time we're going to have to get into the specifics of the heavenly perturbations, the anomalies and supernatural events that occurred above Jerusalem and in the temple that Josephus records. But there was, in that 40-year period of time, there was a host of weirdness that was taking place that greatly unsettled everybody that lived in that area, including, it shook Rome, it shook Nero, all the way up towards the end. When the comet shaped like a sword hangs in the sky for a year, freaked Nero out. He had everybody around him murdered, all of his family, because he was worried it was a sign someone was going to try to take his throne. But I want to make a couple observations in Matthew 24 that I think are really simple when we're reading what it says. Remember, when Matthew 24 was written, it was not written on a piece of paper to you or me. It has applications to you or me, but it was written to somebody in particular. And it was written about something in particular. And even the language, and Brian's already talked about this a little bit, but even in the language, we're talking about flat top roofs that people hang out on that do not exist anymore. Sabbath day travel restrictions. All of these things are very localized to a time and a place. Everything about this passage speaks to a specific time and a specific place, even giving them advice to flee by foot to a geographical location. That is not possible for most of us to flee by foot to the mountains anymore. It's just not. This is very specifically written for very specific reasons to specific people.
Yes, if you look at the phrase "you" throughout the whole passage, there's something like 30 times Jesus says, "When you see the abomination of desolation," when they tell you beforehand, when anyone says to you, he's talking to them. And again, if you're going to take this hyper literal, then you're all of a sudden turning into symbolic language, because all of a sudden he's not talking to the people on the Olivet, on Mount Olives. He's now talking to some future generation. And so you're symbolizing everything. So yeah, that supports that. But I forgot that I do want to jump into the cosmic catastrophes, but one last thing, if we can, and that is verse 21. How are you time-wise? Like, are we okay to keep going for another hour or so?
Bro, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. So verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had been cut short, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the great tribulation verses. And this is where, again, people say, well, that obviously hasn't happened yet, right? And there's a couple of things that are very fascinating about this. First of all, the Great Tribulation, all right? Like what you've been saying, this was written to those people. And if we find actual Bible passages that say it's fulfilled in the first century, then what more argument do we need? Well, guess what? In the book of Revelation, we'll do Revelation another time, but the very, very first chapter, John is setting the stage, and he says, I, John, your brother and partner. I'm sorry, I went too fast. He says, I, John, your brother and partner, in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance in Jesus. And it's interesting because he doesn't say tribulation as a generic word. He says the tribulation, ho tribulation. The ho is the Greek word. And meaning it's not talking about generic tribulation. He's talking about the specific great tribulation. And John, writing Revelation in the first century, we won't talk about dates, but he's written it in the first century. And he's saying, while I'm writing this, I am your partner in the tribulation. So right then and there, the Bible itself says the tribulation is going on in the first century before the temple is being destroyed. Now, let's not talk about the dating. We'll talk about dating some other time. But the point is it's the first century. And so right then and there, that should be enough, but it's not. And I get it. People say, yeah, but what does it say after that? So, a tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world, now, no, will never be. And they'll say, well, that obviously hasn't happened yet because the first century tribulation was not the greatest tribulation that has happened in the world. It wasn't as great as World War II or whatever. You know what I mean? Right. They'll try to take that verse, again, hyper literalistically, and they don't realize that it's actually a a specific generic phrase that is used multiple times in the Bible, and
this
it's
is,
always used in this symbolic sense.
I'll let you take it away, but
No, go ahead.
rhetorical hyperbole, right? Isn't that what they call it? Rhetorical hyperbole?
Yes.
And that's a technical term for it, but this is where comparative studies matter, right? Because
Yes.
Revelation alone, I don't remember what the final count was, but I know that it was very conservative to say that Revelation looked back to the Old Testament over 500 times, right?
Yes.
All of the apocalyptic language, for the most part, in the New Testament is a throwback to the Old Testament somehow. A lot of the places people think Jesus was just making up as he went, he was quoting things from the Old Testament. When you do a comparative study, and this is what is one of the things that has absolutely swayed me over the last year and a half or so, was going back and looking at these things that I started realizing were throwbacks, right? Rhetoric hyperbole. I started seeing this terminology was used in many places in the Old Testament. You go back and Brian will take you through that. You read that and you're like, well, wait a second. This obviously can't be taken literally, and I'm sure Brian will explain why.
Yes. Let me pop out and just say this is typical language. There's lots of different examples used in different scenarios. Like for instance, 1 Kings 3:12 is talking about Solomon. And he says, behold, this is God speaking, behold, I have given you Solomon, a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. So you see how it's that same language. There's no one like it before. There's nothing like it after. This is not hyperliteralistic. It's rhetorical. And otherwise, you're going to have to say that the Bible contradicts itself, because Jesus himself in Matthew 12, verse 42 and verse 43 says, the Queen of South will rise up in judgment against this generation, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, someone greater than Solomon is here. So you have to say, well, the Bible's contradicting itself, because it says there's no one like him, no one afterwards, no one greater than him, and then it says Jesus is greater than him. So obviously this is figurative language. It's just a way of speaking, to which you may still have a hard time accepting that. There are lots more examples. People will say, well, technically the flood is the greatest destruction because it destroyed the entire earth, right? But this is a spiritual phrase, not a literal physical phrase. Yeah. And I'll give you an example.
Do you think it was sort of like a Hebrew term of like, I don't know, like speech? There's like
idiom.
Long live the king, almost. I mean, it's just like long live the king.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, by the way, in my free book, Matthew 24 Fulfilled, I list like 20 examples of this. And it's all different kinds, but it's the same language. Like even in Maccabees, it talks about there was great tribulation in Israel in the time of the Maccabean revolt, such as was not since the time that a prophet appeared. It's the same language. But here's what's interesting. In the Babylonian exile, the first time that the Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, which is very similar to AD 70, right? That happened once before. And it was destroyed in, 586, 587 BC with Babylon. Ezekiel 5:9 is referring to Jerusalem being destroyed during Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Jerusalem. And he says, because of all your abominations, Israel, I will do among you what I have not done, and the like of which I will never do again. Therefore, fathers will eat their sons, and sons will eat their fathers, and I will execute judgments on you. But the point is God himself is promising, I've never done anything like this, and I will never do it again. Well, it's interesting because that's exactly what God did in AD 70 when the temple and Jerusalem was destroyed exactly the same way. They even Josephus talks about there being cannibalism, just like in the first destruction. Now, obviously, I'm not saying God's a liar and God contradicts himself. What I'm saying is this phrase of never like it and never again is simply a way of saying this is so important. This is spiritually transforming. You've got to realize this. It's like nothing I've ever done and nothing, And then in Daniel 9:12, he's talking about the same thing, the abomination of desolation. He says, for under the whole heaven, there has not been done anything like, I'm sorry, I'm off here. Daniel 9:12, he's talking about the Babylonian destruction of the temple the first time. And he says the same thing Ezekiel said. For under the whole heaven, there has not been done anything like what has been done Jerusalem. And in Daniel 12, there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. This is the kind of language that Scripture uses all the time, and it's not intended to be hyper-literalistically. Otherwise, you're going to have to say that the Bible contradicts itself.
Man, can I read some of Isaiah 13? Because that was prophetic about the destruction of Babylon. And you have the same language, right? You have the same language. They come from a distant land, from the end of the heavens, the Lord and his weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty it will come. He talks about how hands are feeble. Every human heart will melt. Okay, well, you can't be literal there. He's not going to melt hearts, right? It's a figure of speech. They will be dismayed, pangs and agony, blah, blah, blah. And he gets down, for the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. Blah, blah. He just keeps going on. You know, therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of fierce anger. You go on with this, right? Did that actually happen when Babylon was destroyed? No. The earth did not shake on its foundations. The moon did not fail to give its light. The stars, what is he talking about? This is very poetic about destroying the wicked.
Yes. Now it's interesting because that's the next passage. That's a good segue. Verse 29 talks about immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, keep in mind, we just proved that the tribulation was going on in the first century. And then it says immediately after the tribulation of those days. So not 2,000 years or 3,000 years later, but immediately after. So again, we keep proving that the context is this is all going to happen within that generation. All these people are going to see it. It's going to happen right in there. It's all going to happen before they die. Immediately it's going to happen this after that, right? So then that's when Jesus talks about the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And this is, this is another one of those things where people will say that, well, that obviously hasn't happened or whatever, but there are so many examples in the Old Testament of this cosmic collapse. Yeah. And let me just tell you up front.
Ezekiel 32. Somebody go read Ezekiel 32. It's just another example.
Yeah. But basically what it means is this. In the ancient world, the Jews, as well as other ancient people, basically believed that their earthly powers, the kings and the rulers, right? They were ruled over by heavenly powers in the heavens, the gods or whatever, and that those heavenly beings were interchangeable with the stars, the sun, the moon, but specifically the stars. So these were symbols, at least symbols, if not some kind of spiritual reference to the supernatural authorities over the earthly authorities. So what they believed was when there was war in heaven, when there's war on earth, there's war in heaven. And Daniel talks about this, right? The Prince of Persia battling with the Prince of Greece, and that all was connected to what was going on in the earthly time period where Greece was battling with Persia, right? And so the idea is that over the earthly powers, there are spiritual powers, and they are connected. So whatever is happening on earth is happening in heaven in a certain way, right? And so when there was this overthrow of earthly powers, in the Bible, there are many examples of this, that when a nation, a city, or a people are overthrown on earth, it is likened to the stars falling from the earth and the sun being, gone dark and the moon turning to blood, etc. This is common terminology of describing that the powers are falling from the heavens. because of that link between the earth and the heavens, right? So this is a common metaphor that they use. And there are some examples that are more clear and obvious than others where they you know, the symbolism is very loud and clear, but there's many examples. Let's just look at a couple of them. One of the classic easy ones is Judges 5:19. This is when Sisera is fighting at Megiddo, and it says the kings, there's multiple kings fighting at Megiddo. It says the kings came and fought, then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh near Megiddo. They took no plunder in silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. So there's an obvious metaphor saying, look, when this Sisera is fighting against these kings in this battle, they're describing it as stars fighting from heaven. So stars are a metaphor for the earth powers as well as the heavenly powers. It's clearly it's symbolism. And think about it too. You know, to them, you know, their world, so to speak, you know, was their earthly authorities. So if a nation was overthrown by another nation, that would be like the world coming to an end. That's like, you know, the stars falling from the sky, because my gosh, everything that we believed in, everything we lived for is now undone and overthrown. So it's that language that's using it. But there's so many examples. So for instance, and let me, you mentioned already Isaiah 13. That's the classic passage. It uses the same language that Jesus uses, right? The stars of heaven in Isaiah 13, and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises. The moon will shed, right? So, and in that chapter, it's pretty well admitted that he's talking about the destruction of Babylon by the Medes in 539 BC. So he's describing the destruction of the heavens and earth he's using that language to describe the destruction of Babylon by the Medes. So we know that really happened. We know that's a prophecy, and we know it applies back then in history, all right? So clearly there, the language is metaphorical in reference to falling powers. But there's multiple examples of this. I talk right about it in my book, but let's just go through a couple. Another one is, and I like this because this is one of my favorite ones, because it's the same language, and it's obvious there's something going on here that's symbolic. When the first temple was destroyed in 587 BC, again, the same scenario here, right? Jeremiah, the prophet, gives a prophecy. In chapter 4:23 is when it begins. And it's interesting because he uses what scholars call decreation language. He's describing as if all of creation is undoing itself and going back to chaos, the chaos of Genesis 1:2, right, where it says formless and void. In other words, it's a spiritual description of when you destroy the temple in 587 BC, it's like you're destroying the whole universe, because that's the spiritual meaning of our covenant, right? Jeremiah 4:23 says this, I looked on the earth and behold, it was formless and void. That formless and void is the same exact language as Genesis 1:2. He's saying the earth went back to the pre-creation chaos. Now look, if you're going to be a literalist, you're going to push yourself into absurdity, because what you're saying is that the entire earth was destroyed, everything, all life and everything was brought back to chaos, and then obviously instantly recreated by God because history kept going on, right? I can't believe anyone's going to be a literalist with this passage, but nonetheless. And then he says, and to the heavens they had no light. I looked to the mountains and they were quaking. The hills moved to and fro. I looked and behold, there was no man. All the birds of heaven had fled. I looked and behold, the fruitful land was a wilderness. The cities were pulled down before the Lord in his fierce anger. And it goes on and on. And my point here that I want to make is, if you look at the passage, you see he's using the language of Genesis 1 to say like everything's been undone of Genesis 1, because creation language in the Bible is covenantal. It's used to describe the covenant. So he's saying it's like everything went back to formlessness and void. It's like the heavens that God created light now have no light. It's like the mountains were quaking and hills moved to and fro. There was no man. You know, Genesis 1 says God created man, but he's saying now there's no man. Does that mean no man exists anymore? All the birds of the heaven fled. Remember, what day was it that the birds were created? He's saying he's undoing the creation acts. And this is obviously spiritual metaphor. Why? Because the covenant with Yahweh that was embodied in the Old Testament temple was so spiritually significant that it was used metaphorically of the cosmos, or the heavens and the earth. The temple was a spiritual incarnation of the heavens and the earth. So if the temple's destroyed, it's like all of the heavens and the earth are being unraveled.
You know what blows my mind? Not to change the subject, but when
please do.
When I started investigating the preterist position, all it did was solidify how crazy I think people are that want to go back to living under the stipulations of the old covenant. When you look at what God did to destroy it, something Josephus said that blew my mind. I don't know. I can't remember if he said it or if I just drew the connection. I don't remember. So if somebody quoted this, I'm not taking credit for it. But essentially, like when Titus was like raising his hands in the air to God, like, I didn't mean for this to happen. Like there was a point that was made somewhere along the line that when God has set his sights on destroying you, even the enemy that's responsible for bringing it to pass can't save you if they want to. And it just showed, like, when the enemy that's tasked with destroying you, even if he decides to save you, they can't save you. When God is involved in it, he will absolutely destroy you. Every atom and molecule will separate. And when you see what God did to the old system in destroying it, why would anybody want to tangle with that level of wrath and try to force people in returning to it? Blows my mind.
Amen. I totally agree. Yeah, that could be a whole nother.
Yeah, it's a whole nother show.
A whole hour on that.
That in there for the Hebrew roots crowd.
Absolutely. Now, if we move on to verse 30, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. All right. Now, the Greek on this is a little ambiguous, but most people and many translations say something like, then then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, or something like that. And they get this picture that they're going to see the Son of Man in heaven, right? But that's not what the Greek actually means. Then will appear. Let's see. I got to get this right because I'm not a Greek scholar, but I've read Greek scholars who talk about this. And I guess, let's see here.
You haven't just read them. You're friends with one really good one, so.
Yeah, I know. But my point is just that the scholars will tell you that one of the ways that the Greek, it's not clear, so it's not, no view owns this verse. The ways of translating is that then it will appear the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. So in other words, there's a sign that's going to appear that tells you that the Son of Man is in heaven. And why is that important? Well, because the Jews were denying Jesus was Messiah, right? And the Christians were saying Jesus has ascended into heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father, which was blasphemy to the unbelieving Jews, right? So he's saying, well, look, there's a sign's going to appear that proves the Son of Man in heaven. All right? What is that sign? We'll get to that. But I have to just say that verse doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see him in heaven. However, there is, we'll get to the clouds of heaven in a second. There are passages where Josephus says some people saw a vision in the heavens of armies in the heavens. So it could very well mean a vision in the heavens. But that's not to me, because that's what people say. Well, that obviously hasn't happened because all the tribes of the earth don't mourn. Well, guess what? Actually, it has happened. And the first thing to understand is, and this is where you can't just take things on their shallow interpretation. You look at the word earth. The word earth is ges in, I don't know how to say it, G-E-S, ges in Greek. And that's a problematic rendering of the word. The Bible, it might surprise people, but the Bible is a English translation, and people who are translating it have very specific belief systems that not all Christians agree with. So translations themselves can show bias. This is a case where it shows bias. The word for earth, when we read earth, what do we think of?
The whole rock we're on.
The globe. Yeah, the whole globe, right?
Unless you're flat earther.
Unless you're flat earther.
Then it's round with a dome.
Right. But you know what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah.
so we read earth and we always think of that globe picture, and we're thinking that's what it is. That's not what the word means. The word is actually best translated as land. Now, it's true that word land, the Greek gay or the Hebrew eretz, it's true that word land can mean a local land. It could mean all the land that you see, So it has varying interpretations depending on the context. But one of the strongest meanings in the Bible, when you hear that phrase, is the land. It's the land of Israel. And furthermore, when you see the phrase, all the tribes of the land is always, I'm pretty sure in the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament, tribes of the land is a reference to the tribes of Israel. Yeah. They never refer to the nations as the tribes of the nations or the tribes of the land. They always talk about the nations versus the tribes of Israel or the tribes of the land. So this phrase is talking about all the tribes of Israel will mourn, not the nations of the earth. Why will they mourn? Well, what have we said from the very beginning? Jesus said, you're killing the Messiah. You're going to be judged. You're going to lose your house. You're going to suffer because you rejected Messiah. So this is simply reaffirming all these tribes of Israel that rejected the Messiah will mourn. Now, not the remnant, the true believers, they won't, but those who rejected him will. And so that's an interesting, and there's more of that in Revelation, but we'll
Which
talk
takes
about
us
that
back to the context of Matthew 24, which was Matthew 23, where Jesus pronounces judgment on the leadership.
Yes.
Right back to the original point.
I wrote an article on my blog. It's for free, Godawa.com. You can search for it, or look for the word earth or something in my blog. And whenever you read the word earth in the New Testament, you should change it to the word land. You really should, because it's creating false interpretations left and right because of this globe concept that we are embedded with. They did not have an understanding of the globe. They didn't even think of it in those terms.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because it actually meant land, and land could mean dirt. It could mean local location, or it could mean all that you could see, or it meant the land of Israel. So when you read the land, like I've told people, go through Revelation and change earth to land, and you're going to suddenly see the meaning of Revelation is not what you thought it was in terms of the globe. So, and then let's move on to the next part of the verse. And then this is the one verse that these were the bunch of verses, but probably the one verse that was the hardest one for me to understand. Once I got it, I fully embraced the preterist to understand it in Matthew 27, and that was, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And I fully understand why that's one of the hardest verses. It was for me, because it seems to us as we're reading the English in plain English, well, that's obviously the Son of Man surfing on a cumulus nimbus, I like to say, right? It's going to be literally on the clouds of heaven, right? Coming on the clouds of heaven. And we don't realize how much we are conditioned by these assumptions, but they suddenly start to slough off when you look and find and discover that this phrase, coming on the clouds, is a common phrase used in the Old Testament, and what it means is not what we thought it meant. So let's take a look at some of those verses. And it's really, this was beautiful to me.
This is sort of like a preterist Magic School Bus cartoon where we just keep going back and learning lessons from someplace else. That's the only way to interpret prophecy, is to go back and look at all of the things comparatively that were quoted and referenced,
Amen. Amen. So let's see. So coming on the clouds, there's dozens of examples. Let's just look a couple of them. The probably one of the the most exact similarities, right? Exact references is Isaiah 19. And Isaiah 19, this is a prophecy in about 700 BC, and it's about Assyria coming in to conquer Egypt. There are geopolitical events going on in the Isaiah, and one of them is that Assyria is going to come in and conquer Egypt. This is what Isaiah is prophesying. And it actually happened by the Ethiopian ruler Shabaka, but whatever. I'm sorry, the Ethiopian ruler Shabaka was in alliance with the Assyrians against Egypt. But nonetheless, Isaiah 19 says this: the oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. There it is, that language again, the same exact language, the Lord riding on a swift cloud coming to Egypt. Now, does that mean that Yahweh was literally surfing on a cumulus nimbus on a cloud coming to Egypt, literally, physically? No. It's a metaphorical reference to the fact that Yahweh was going to judge Egypt by using Assyria to do so. All right? And so this notion of coming on the clouds, there's a lot to it. There's also ancient Canaanite literature uses the same language about Baal. Baal is the rider on the clouds. What it meant was that you are the God who's riding the clouds was a storm god who would bring judgment. So when it says he's coming on the clouds, he's saying, I'm bringing judgment to you. And so God came multiple times in the Old Testament. He came on clouds to these various nations. Another example, let's see, I want to give some of the... well,
which essentially, because what you're saying is Egypt was judged, this was fulfilled, and God did not literally ride on the clouds.
Yes, exactly. And when you see that this is a metaphor that's used over and over again, you see, oh, this is an idiom. This is a way of speaking that basically means God's going to come in judgment. And by the way, he does it. How does he come in judgment? Is he coming and he's doing all the work? No, he does it through another nation. He uses Assyria to destroy Egypt. But that's still him coming because God is, sovereignly in control. So I was trying to find the one that I really love, and I can't catch it right now. But oh no, here it is. Yeah. You mentioned this earlier. Jeremiah 4:13-16, when Babylon is coming against Jerusalem. Babylon's going to come in 586 BC. And they're going to destroy Jerusalem and bring Israel into captivity, right? Jeremiah is prophesying that event in Jeremiah 4. And here's what he says. Behold, he, Yahweh, comes up like clouds. His chariot's the whirlwind. His horses swifter than eagles, etc. Behold, we are ruined. And then he says in verse 16, warn the nations, he is coming. That's Yahweh. Announce to Jerusalem, besiegers come from a distant land. They shout against the cities of Judah. Those besiegers, as you read the full passage, it's Babylon. We can go on a dozen passages. I'm not kidding you. The point here is that when Yahweh comes in judgment, he uses another nation, and it's usually a pagan nation, but it doesn't matter who it is. But when God uses Babylon to chastise Israel in 586 BC and to destroy the temple, he describes it as coming on the clouds. So God uses a pagan nation to chastise Israel and the destruction of the first temple. Therefore, now you look back in AD 70, and Jesus is saying, I'm coming on the clouds. I'm going to destroy your temple. I'm going to destroy Jerusalem. And how does he come? He comes in the armies of the Roman Empire. He's using the Roman Empire, the Roman armies, as his tools to accomplish his judgment, just like Luke 21 said, the pagan armies surrounding Israel. So, it goes on and on, but the one last reference that I'd just like to make is the fact that the classic reference to this is in Daniel. And in Daniel 7, where I think Jesus draws some of this imagery from. Is it 7? Yeah. Daniel 7. This is the vision that Daniel has. And he says, Daniel 7, verse 13, I saw in the night visions, behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. Now, all Christians are going to acknowledge that's Jesus, all right? To him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, and all peoples, nations, his dominion, etc., etc. Now this, if you read the context, this is the context of these pagan nations of beasts are going to be against Israel, but God's going to ultimately judge them. So this terminology is judgment terminology. But it's interesting because it says, behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. So many scholars will tell you that that's what Jesus is actually referencing is Daniel 7. That's the fulfillment. And it's interesting that in Daniel 7, Jesus did not come down to the earth. He goes up to heaven on the clouds of heaven. He goes up to his throne, to the Ancient of Days, right? So his coming in judgment on the clouds is a coming to his throne in heaven as he's destroying Israel on earth through the Roman armies. That's sort of one of the ways that people understand that. Or his ascension to heaven is the expression of all power that then is what Jesus is proving. So when you go back to Matthew 24, this is what remember what the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. He's saying, I'm going to prove to you that I am the fulfillment of Daniel 7:13, ascending to the throne. I'm going to prove it to you. And those clouds of heaven are going to be judgment upon you. And so the proof that I'm in heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father, is this destruction that I'm bringing upon Jerusalem. And I'm going to destroy the temple. And that's the proof that I'm telling you. That's why you shouldn't have rejected me, right? Is there something you want to add to that or expand on that?
No, I just think it's really interesting that, the very next thing in that verse, it's like when he uses that language and historically in scripture, it depicts him using other nations to bring judgment. It's like, I don't know if you wanted to get into this next or not, or we could hit it briefly, but that next verse is, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds. So many people use that in like a rapture context, but here it's like, it's like, I don't know that I've ever noticed it before until I started looking at it from that preterist mindset. But I'm like, okay, so this verse about coming on the clouds is pretty much him saying, I'm sending in an army to do this. And at the same time, immediately in that next verse, I'm sending in my own people, my messengers, to gather my elect. It's like two opposite sides of the coin. I'm going to send in a pagan army to destroy you, and I'm going to send my people and go get my people.
Yeah. That's one way of seeing it. I will say that this verse, I have an interpretation of it, gathering his elect from the four winds. I don't know if it's absolutely the right interpretation, but it makes sense to me. And it may be a little bit different from what you're saying, but basically, I do agree with you. There's these assumptions that they picture angels. Okay, so therefore, angels are these heavenly beings that come down and grab you like the rapture, etc. But if you look at the word angel in Greek, unfortunately for us English readers, is the word angel is angelos. It means messenger, and it's used of Christians preaching the gospel, of the apostles. It basically means messenger and messenger of God. So Christians, like you said, are messengers, and so they don't necessarily have to be supernatural beings. But what I find fascinating about this is this whole idea of gathering from the four winds and stuff. Well, what happened after the destruction of the temple? The Jews were most of them were taken away into captivity, and they were devastated. for decades to come. Christians, a lot of Christians that got out, they went to the hills, they went to Pella, so that a lot of them survived. They got out of the judgment. But there's something else that happened. That was a turning point in history that's so important, because from that point on, Judaism just became a different entity. It was no longer Torah. It was no longer Torah oriented. It was actually rabbinic oriented. And if you look at history, you see that's what happened, and it sort of deadened its Old Testament connection, which is really,
that's interesting. I don't. What does that entail? Like, what was the difference?
That's where you got the Babylonian Talmud and all that, the Talmud and the Midrash and all that. So it became focused on rabbinic writings rather than the Torah. And rabbinic writings are about the Torah, but you see, my point is, Judaism changed. Why did it change? Because they no longer had the temple. The temple was the focus of the whole religion. So they had to create something to take its place, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the rabbis did. And Titus actually allowed some of Josephus and some of them to keep some of their books and create a new academy in Yavna. And then that's where they built up rabbinic Judaism. So it's interesting because rabbinic Judaism was no longer, Torah oriented after that. But the other thing that happened was, and it also deadened historically, it would be a while before they would come back and to grow in the earth. But the other thing that happened was that Christianity had, up until that time, had been a nascent seed, so to speak, right? They were growing, but they were also persecuted by Nero. A lot of them were killed by other Jews and stuff. But when that destruction happened, that historically speaking, after that, the gospel exploded around the earth. Christianity grew like a weed. It grew like a mustard seed, not like a weed. It grew like a mustard seed from that point on, historically speaking. And so what one interpretation of this is that it's basically saying, look, Christians went out, and the notion of the elect are, what does that mean? Well, that means basically those who God chose to save. So this is describing Christians going out into all the world and preaching the gospel, and people being drawn into God's kingdom. And it's really that simple. It doesn't have to be magical, supernatural angels and raptures and all that kind of stuff. But like I said, there are other ways of seeing that, but that's one way that at least makes sense of it. And the interesting thing is to wrap up what we've been talking about, we're now at the end, unless you want to add something.
No, I think the point you just made was super important, though. That's not something I realized or looked at historically until I started really studying the destruction of Jerusalem. Was the history of the church. The destruction of Jerusalem was almost like a mushroom cloud of fertilizer for the church. It's like the fallout. Exactly. He just like rained fertilizer across the land. There we go with the land, and Christianity just absolutely exploded.
But by the way, here's where it's very fascinating, and Hebrews hints at this, because remember how the paradigm here is the covenant, the old covenant is fading out, the new covenant is fading in. That's Hebrews 9 and such. But the old covenant is not completely gone until the earthly incarnation is destroyed.
Right.
But if you look at the book of Acts, what was the trouble that the church had? A massive trouble, because all the first Christians were Jews, and they didn't know what to do with the Torah. Some of them said, well, we got to still keep Torah, and some of them would still go to temple, and Paul even still went to temple. In fact, he wasn't necessarily against going to temple, because the book of Acts has them going to temple, right? So, but like I said, they're in this, we call it the transition period between covenants. So it's kind of messy, historically speaking, right? So in one sense, Christianity is saying the old covenant's over, the new covenant's here, but yet there's the old covenant's still standing. They're still doing sacrifices. And then some of them, Christians were troubled. They didn't know what to do. What do we tell the Gentiles have to follow the laws too? And that's where all this problem was coming in. But as soon as the old temple was destroyed by God for the purposes of establishing the new covenant, never to be rebuilt again, never to have been rebuilt again. Some people believe it's going to be rebuilt, but historically speaking, it's never been rebuilt, right?
Right.
The point is once that temple was gone, the Christians now no longer had confusion. Yeah. The Jewish Christians now are like, well, we don't, Jesus is the temple, we're the temple, we don't need the temple anyway. it made them free to then go out into all the world because they didn't have to stay in Jerusalem. That's why Jesus said, you're going to go from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and all the ends of the earth. He wanted them to get out of Jerusalem, but so many of them were stuck because they're still connected to Judaism. Once Judaism is demolished, that freed them up to then expand around the earth. So that's a beautiful truth that I'm just
absolutely
amazed by. Yeah. And then we get to the ending, from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as the branches become tender and put out its leaves, you know the summer is near. So when you see these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think even many futurists now admit that the old view that the fig tree is Israel, and it was a symbol. Oh, it's all of a sudden symbolic now, not hyperliteral. It was a symbol of Israel becoming a nation within a generation. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away. Within a generation of Israel becoming a nation, all these things are going to happen. Well, most people now recognize that we're like more than 2.5 generations past. So it never happened. Israel became a nation in 48. We're now entering the 20s, and
which now the arguments just continue. 70
it's
years,
80 years.
80 is by might, And...
Yeah, they keep changing it. But in all honesty, I think a lot of them are saying, no, that's not really what it is. That's not reference. And it is ridiculous because Israel is never referred to as a fig tree. So
what you just brought up is something I've been talking about with others in my circle. I honestly think that the argument about Israel becoming a nation again, and one of the reasons why this topic is so popular and this specific verse that gets used so often in this conversation, I think one of the reasons why post-mill and a-mill positions are being incorporated back into the debates is because the cracks in the foundation of premillennial dispensationalism continue to grow. Because in all of the pleasant conversations that I've had with people on the subject that were pre-mill dispies, it was, but all of these people never had what we have. Israel became a nation again in 1948.
Yeah.
Start breaking down all this stuff. It always that is always the anchor point for the argument. It's like, well, guess what? You're losing that, and you're good. What are you going to do when it's gone? When you can't push it back any further? What are you going to do?
Absolutely.
What are they going to do?
I know. And well, they just, like you said, they just keep redefining it now. So now a generation can be as much as 100 years. But the truth is people are catching on, and they're like, no, that's not what it means. Basically, look at what he says. He pretty much says what he means. Talk about plain language. He makes no reference to fig tree being a metaphor for anything else. He's using the fig tree and its branches coming out, knowing summer is near. The metaphor for that is, so also when you see these things, you know that he is near. So the metaphor is simply, when you see these things happening, you know it's near. So there is there's no symbolic reference beyond the fact that when these things start happening, you know it's very near historically. And then he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So he ends up repeating what he said before, which again, just to remind everyone, what he's saying is then everything within these two phrases that I gave, all the way from, chapter 23 to verse 34 in chapter 24, all these things will happen within this generation that I'm speaking to.
His words.
His words. Yeah, those who hear his words. And so whatever interpretation you're going to take, this was also another thing that sort of challenged me when I was a futurist. And I was realizing, well, Jesus himself is saying that, like when I had trouble with this whole thing of Son of Man coming on the clouds, it's not the way I thought it was. And it was so troubling to me. Well, then what is it, And don't I have to follow what Jesus says? And if Jesus says everything within this passage has to take place within a generation, then whatever symbolic way you want to interpret it, it has to be interpreted as taking place within the generation. And so in my mind, if Jesus gives you the hermeneutical principle, that pretty much settles it. So
that's one of the reasons why I loved Sproul's The Last Days According to Jesus, because it was one of the first things I explored when I got interested in this. And it wasn't the last days according to Paul. It wasn't the last days according to Sproul. His entire study revolved around what did Jesus say? And he didn't deviate from that. Let's just look at what Jesus said, and analyze that. And that game changer for me.
Yeah, yeah. Now, there are more. There's more in this passage we can go into, but I think we pretty much covered the most important elements that need to be addressed. And as I said, I write all about this in my book, End Times Bible Prophecy. And if you buy my book, you can sign up for a free copy of Matthew 24 Fulfilled, where I literally have almost 200 pages where I just list very little of my own writing. All I do is I list the verse in Matthew, more detail than we did. I list the verse in Matthew 24 in all this chapter, and then I literally quote from scriptures that fulfill it or historical sources, and I give the sources and I write them out. So it's literally a verse by verse exegesis and a proof of all of these verses being fulfilled. It's very, very helpful for those who really want to see that the volume here. We're not just saying like, well, one way of interpreting it is this way. What we're saying is there's overwhelming evidence in both the Bible and history to prove that this has been fulfilled, that it's really actually other interpretations, in my opinion, are far weaker because we have far more evidence.
This whole thing, we keep talking about a comparative study. What you're saying is you have an actual physical, tangible resource that provides anybody to be able to look at the comparative study. So
absolutely.
Comparative study. What do people have to do to get that? They buy the End Times Prophecy.
When you buy the book, gives you a little link, and you say, go here and sign up to, you give me my email and you get on my email list, and I'll send you the free book. And you can unsubscribe from the email list anytime you want. But if I'm there, I'll give you a bunch of cool things. Or I'm doing a raffle for a bunch of Ken Gentry stuff on Revelation. Unfortunately, by the time people see this, the raffle will be over. But I do stuff like that. I give stuff away. I have whenever I have podcasts like this, I'll alert people, say, hey, check this out or whatever. So you can sign up for it and keep up to date, or just get the free book and unsubscribe. I don't care. I don't want to send you stuff if you don't want to get it. But the point is that it's a reference tool for people who really want to say, like someone says something about some verse and you go, yeah, that's a good point. Oh, what's the preterist view on that? Well, you can look up the verse literally, boom, and then see everything that all the passages that I give to prove the point. Very little of my own writing in there.
Fascinating. So, where are we going next in Matthew? What do you think is the most important thing?
Well, I mean, I think for this discussion, we're probably done, because there's more to talk about after 24, I guess. I mean, we could talk about that next time if you want.
Yeah.
But this is also the next part of Matthew 24, where it starts talking about, but of that day, an hour no one knows, and then it talks about the parable of the 10 virgins and stuff. There are different interpretations of that, and within preterist camp, and I'd be more interested in moving on to Revelation, because I think there's a lot that we can open people's eyes to, and that'll take a couple sessions, I'm sure. But
well, let me just ask you this real quick. Okay, so like a lot of people right up until like verse 29, they'll say, well, I could see. A lot of people have said this. I can see that, which we went further past 29.
Yeah,
but. Because there's so many different interpretations, the question is there anything in Matthew 24 that you believe has not yet been fulfilled?
No. But I will say this, that's a good thing that you bring up, because you're right. I've heard that too. Many people are now starting to admit that our arguments are very strong, and they'll say, well, okay, I can see the first part of Matthew 24 being fulfilled in the first century. Yeah. But the last obviously hasn't, meaning the Great Tribulation, the sun, moon, and stars, and the coming of the Son of Man. That hasn't happened yet. But you have to recognize this, people. When you're saying that, you're only saying that because you don't want it to be fulfilled. You're not saying that because the text says that, because there's nowhere in the text that says, okay, now that was fulfilled, but then this says yet to come. Because at the end of the day, even the verses about the Son of Man coming on the clouds are within the passage where Jesus says all these things will take place within one generation. So my point is you can't arbitrarily say, oh yeah, all that's fulfilled up until AD 70, but then this jumps ahead 2,000 years later, because Jesus doesn't say that. He says it's all fulfilled within one generation, including coming on the clouds of heaven. Okay. So after that verse of 34, this generation will not pass away, you might be able to make the argument that those are about another time. But we're just talking about everything within that bookends of this generation, right?
The major points.
Yeah.
Now
there
go
are
ahead.
preterists who afterwards, like Ken Gentry believes that after that passage 34, this generation will not pass away. After that, it starts to talk about the second coming of Christ in our future. But there are other preterists, partial preterists and full preterists, but Gary DeMar will argue, and I'm more in his camp, where no, it's still talking about that first century, and doing the field, and will be left, and one will be taken, all that kind of stuff. That's still talking about the first century. But whatever. To me, it's not as important as everything else. Once you get up to that coming on the clouds of heaven, and you have to acknowledge that was the first century according to Jesus, I can't interpret it any outside of that time period, then that's the most powerful argument that makes sense.
Okay, so I have to ask this. Now, this does not have to turn into an hour-long conversation, but what I normally field as far as my messages and comments are when we talk about how Matthew 24 has been fulfilled.
Yes.
Since so many people attribute their understanding of the rapture to passages in Matthew 24, what they hear us saying is that we believe the rapture has already been fulfilled.
Okay, fair enough. Let's address that. No, that's fine. That's fine. That's a good one, because I think that the context of that verse, if I can get it accurately here.
While you're looking that up, what I want people to understand is that the preterist position does not take away a future rapture, a parousia of Jesus Christ coming and physically ruling and reigning in his kingdom being coronated. I'm just going to bring this out right now at the front and give you the conclusion. But we look at this whole biblical tribulation as something that's been fulfilled. So our understanding of the rapture is not intrinsically connected to the 7-year tribulation. Everybody else is always pre, mid, post. And we're like, tribulation has been fulfilled. Jesus is coming in the future at some time, we don't know when, but we're looking at a completely different future history of the church than this pre-mill dispensational 7-year Antichrist beast system thing. It's not how we're looking at it at all. So
yes, absolutely. Fair enough. That's very good. The passage that most people assume is a rapture, though, even if you look at it in context, it can't possibly be, because it says in verse 40, then actually before that it says, these days will be like the days of Noah. When Noah entered the ark, they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken, one left. 2 women will be grinding in a mill. One will be taken, one left. That's the rapture, right? Well, no, actually, when it talks about those who are taken and those who are left, those who are taken are the ones who are judged. Because in the Bible, or in the passage, he says, it's like the days of Noah. Well, those who were left was Noah and his family. They were not judged. The people who were judged were the ones who were taken away. But there's another connection that I think that this passage is actually making a reference to the first. It's making an analogy to the first destruction of the temple when Jews were taken away into exile. Because Josephus is talking about, first of all, when they came to the first, in 587 BC, when Babylon came, they took Jews away. Some were left, some were taken away into exile. Those who were taken were judged. Get it? Josephus himself, well, by the way, Jeremiah is the one that talks about that. Jeremiah 6:11 says, God says, I'm full of wrath, poured out on the children in the street, on the gatherings of the young men. Their houses shall be turned over to others, their fields and wives together, for I will stretch out my hand against the inhabitants of the land. So he's saying, God's saying, I'm going to, it's very similar in language. See what I'm saying? Yeah. And then Josephus, when he's describing the destruction of the temple in AD 70, he actually says the Romans left only the populace of Jerusalem and sold the rest of the multitude with their wives and children. And indeed, the number of those that were sold was immense. 40,000 were saved, whom Caesar let go, whether one of them pleased. So my point is that Jesus is using the language of Jeremiah that Jeremiah used of the first destruction of the temple, meaning people are going to come and take away your fields and such because you're going to be judged. So that would be my argument there, where that has nothing to do with the rapture.
And to be fair, even years ago when I was studying this passage, I remember being around Southern Baptist people that understood this, that said, no, wait, they were premill dispensationalists. They said, you can't use that passage for a rapture.
Yeah,
This passage, that's not something that's debated or different. Even in the premill disby camps, nobody uses, no academic is going to look at this and say this is a rapture passage. So anyway.
Yeah. No, good point. Whoo!
It's a lot, man.
That's pretty helpful, I hope.
I think so too. In fact,
you got to let me know how the responses are again, and prep everybody. We're gonna try to address Revelation next. Did we?
I'm excited because honestly, like, Revelation is the book like I've studied the least as I've been building up to it, trying to make sure I'm on the right track. And you've spent so much time with Ken Gentry stuff that's not even released. I'm actually really excited to learn. Yeah. I'm going to learn a lot about that. So,
it's really cool.
Anyway, guys, find Brian's books, briangodawa.com. You can find them on Audible. I've listened to 6 of his books so far. I think, End Times Prophecy. I read Noah Primeval. I've read the first 3 of the Chronicles of the Apocalypse series, which is sort of a preterist fictional series. I get my Audible credit in a few days, and I'll finish up the 4th one. Fantastic series of books. If you want a better understanding of kind of like what we're talking about, how it played out like real time with some fictional license, the Chronicles of the Apocalypse series is a great book that will help you learn as you're enjoying a story, and it is a really good story. At the same time, I hope this conversation on Matthew 24 was helpful, because most of the questions preterists tend to get usually come out of Matthew 24, right? These are the passages that always come up, so we've started here. It was not comprehensive. Obviously, it was not exhaustive, but you now have a basic conversation introduction to Matthew 24. You've heard some of the preterist arguments. Brian has made you very well aware of a comparative study in paper form, digital, that is available to you somehow through his website. Email him, buy his book, whatever, get a link, sign up for his newsletter. And through that, you'll actually, I'm pretty sure on your website too, you list a lot of other sources where people can go and find more information from different people that you've learned from.
Free articles. Yeah, absolutely. Free articles and free books, actually. I have free books on the Chronicles of the Apocalypse research page. You can get a bunch of free books like from Ken Gentry and stuff. It's really good stuff.
So yeah, absolutely.
Online.
Gary DeMar, Ken Gentry, essential. Find their lectures on YouTube. Anyway, you guys, just doing our best to at least, this is a personal point of conviction for me, because I feel like I've spent most of my life being wrong. And even though I am the least popular person on my own show, when I put this stuff out, I'm absolutely okay with that, because I believe I'm right. And I believe the scriptures for what they say. And I'm willing to.
Well, not only that.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't mean, I'm sorry. I was going to say, and also though, the reason why I'm into, like, how can I put it? It's not like, if you look at people who are into end times, it's like their whole life. Everything is all end times. It's always about end times because it's so exciting to them. We're in the last days, and we get to see all the prophecies fulfilled, and who's the beast and who's the Antichrist and all this kind of stuff. It's their life. I'm not interested in that. And I'm not interested in that kind of thinking. I want to get about the work of the kingdom of God, etc. But I see the importance of how this futuristic worldview has really incapacitated the body of Christ in many ways, because they're spending all this time in their conspiracy theories about this stuff, that they're not really getting out and getting the gospel out, the gospel of the kingdom, and that they're destroying the faith of a lot of people, because what happens is they're, within 5 years, all these things that they're claiming don't end up happening, and they're not true, and they keep changing their views, and people start realizing that, and they start throwing the baby out bathwater and thinking, well, what is this Christianity? So this premillennialism, this futuristic sort of approach is destroying a lot of faith, and it's making Christians look bad because of all of these false prophecies that none of them occur. So my point is that it's a serious issue to, what you believe about the end of the world will affect the way you're living now. And it is very important in how we live our lives. And so I want us to so it's worth it to me to put in that time and energy to try to correct those views, knowing that we're in the minority, but one day we won't be.
And And if we lived, I mean, we're in the minority now, but only in the minority the last 100 years. And this is a book
Yeah.
for anybody that's interested. The Puritan Hope, Revival, and the Interpretation of Prophecy. People don't understand. We are living on a foundation of blessings that were laid by men of God that viewed the prophecy and the future of the church very differently than the church has in the last 100 years. And the work that they put in, by God's grace, God using these men, in his sovereignty and his providence to bring forth the fruit that we enjoy today, were built on a different understanding of where the church was headed, and even the future of Israel itself. And so anyway, I'm going to do a show with Josh Peck on this in the near future on his channel. But
Cool.
this is a beautiful book for anybody that wants to understand how the Puritans convicted me in this area, and one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it now. So anyway, Brian, thank you for being on. I can't wait to do the next one. We'll email back and forth. We'll figure out when we go live on Revelation.
Sounds good, man.
All right, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out with us tonight. It should be Friday when this airs. So if it's Friday and you're watching it, then this was successful, and it should be streaming on all the platforms that we're on, which are like 50 of them by now, as we're trying to get away from YouTube. So guys, have a good weekend. Love you. Thank you. Peace.